Love and life interested me so that I dared to knock at the door of the cosmos.
Welcome to the Sun Ra Arkive Podcast. Since 2002, Sun Ra Arkive has been an extension of my personal study and sharing those discoveries with others. Our goal is dedicated to preserving the legacy of jazz musician, composer, keyboard pioneer, visionary philosopher, and band leader Sun Ra and his group of master musicians, the Sun Ra Orchestra. You can follow us online at facebook.com/Sun Ra Arkive and explore our library of articles at sunraarchive.blogspot.com. Hello.
Hello.
Hey, Burgin. How are you? It's Christopher.
Hey, Christopher. I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I would like to welcome Burgin Mathews to the Sun Ra Arkive Podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be talking with you.
Burgin is a writer, a teacher, and a radio host. He has a radio show, The Lost Child, on Birmingham Mountain Radio 107.3 FM. The name of Burgin's first book is Doc, The Story of a Birmingham Jazzman, and it was co-authored with Frank Doc Adams, published by University of Alabama Press. It's available in hardcover and paperback editions. It was published on December 18th of 2018 and is available at any fine local bookstore as well as Amazon.com and other online retailers. If you want a teaser and you want to get a sense of the incredible story that's contained in full form in this book, that Burgin also has a blog on his website, and there are several tagged articles specifically that focus on some of the Sun Ra content that you should take a look at. And in particular, the Magic Citizen article, I think, is particularly magical. Dr. Frank Doc Adams was a musician in the Birmingham jazz scene. He was born in 1928. He departed in 2014, and he served as an educator in Birmingham city schools for more than 40 years, both as a band director and the district supervisor of music. For his contributions to Alabama jazz, he was a charter inductee in 1978 to the Alabama Jazz Hall of Fame. And as a part of Frank Doc Adams' story around the Birmingham jazz community, it also includes experiences that Frank had as a member of the Sonny Blunt Orchestra. And there's also great illumination in this book about Frank's experience and observations of the younger Herman Sonny Sun Ra Blunt in his formative years. Where to start? It's a huge story, and I will say as a Sun Ra fan that we have, as far as major works in the bibliography to date, we've got Dr. Robert Campbell and Chris Trent's earthly discography of Sun Ra, which covers Sun Ra's recorded works. And then contemporaneously to that, we had John Swed's Space is the Place biography of Sun Ra. And those are really kind of pillars in the official popular Sun Ra story as far as books go. And in years since then, we've had excellent scholarship and discoveries. I think most profoundly was John Corbett's saving of Alton Abraham, his personal effects after he passed away. And Alton Abraham being an early associate of Sun Ra's in Chicago. After Sun Ra moved from Birmingham, Alton was a partner of Sun Ra's who handled more of the business aspects of establishing the Sun Ra Orchestra and Saturn Records, in addition to both of them being part of a research organization into all of the hidden knowledge that Sun Ra expressed through his work. John Corbett saved Alton Abraham's effects from the dumpster, and within those effects are early papers, artwork for Saturn releases, and perhaps most profoundly an archive of somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 to 600 audio tapes of varying formats. And that was a major discovery to add to Dr. Campbell and John Swed's work. And for me, Burgin's work to talk about Sonny Blunt's early years in Birmingham, I'd say, is the fourth pillar to Sun Ra scholarship in that area. I have a great admiration for the work you've done because it helps to add to the story of Sun Ra in a way that those other researchers just started to really scratch the surface on. You've added a look into Sun Ra's formative years in detail and depth and context that I don't think any other researcher has done. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I am honored by those words tremendously. That means a lot. I have been really lucky to, one, be in Birmingham and interested in Birmingham's music history, including but not limited to Sonny Blunt, but to be here and to have met Frank Adams, who is really the last living link to Sonny's 1940s Birmingham bands. If it hadn't been for that relationship, I wouldn't be doing any of this. And Doc Adams, who is now deceased, certainly shares in any accolade that you just give me. I don't know if I deserve, but Frank Adams really was the living connection to that history, and I'm grateful to have worked with him.
When you connect with a person like that, you can get that, as he said, their vibrations. And he always claimed me as his saxophone player. So say, "You're Frank, yeah, the saxophone player." And he was Sun Ra. He belonged to the sun and whatever. As I remember one time they were discussing some political things. He said, "They all are going to get to fighting. Most of them will." And I try to get his sound, and they say, "But they'll all destroy each other. And if they fight too much, and no spills and things go fine, I'll just catch my ship back to Venus or Mars and leave them there." And he would say, truly, that you all are blessed. You don't know how blessed you are to have me here with you for a while. So I listened to all that when I was just in my teens, And a lot of times I'd sit down and think, what in the world was he trying to do? And then, if you followed it closely, he was able to get out of people things that we couldn't get out of ourselves. In fact, I enjoyed it in being in his group, because he was always teaching things and he always showing you things, and you don't even know that you are learning them. See, his method was a method of putting things out of people. And one of the strange things about it, his culture, his imagination just flowed all out into people. I remember playing the Smithfield Project, and every time I pass by that place, and sometimes I want to look in there to see if we're still playing in there, because we played all the time, and in the Smithfield Project, housing project. And I remember that's why we want to get that Rick Hootie Blues, because he'd play that thing all night, and Fletcher Ahmad was his singer. And as I call his name, most of them, all of them are gone. Jahi had played the alto. Teddy Smith was the one I took his place. He was the most fantastic saxophone player. But he didn't read notes. And what Sonny would do, he would write just what we call goop. That's hold notes, you hold a do note under the singer. And And when they would play Hootie Blues, he would extend those songs, add choruses to them, and he'd be up there for 12 or 15 chords just rocking till people just nearly fell out in that place. And he never played the same thing twice. His mind just felt with organization, natural organization, and he could do all these kind of things.
When it originally came out, there was a sense of joy and discovery and thrill that I had in hearing those stories and seeing the associated images that you've researched. What is, I believe, the earliest known photograph of Sun Ra, and just the absolute thrill and joy of seeing those materials was really quite profound.
Well, thank you. And I'd be happy to talk about the first time I saw that photo, which was also a really thrilling moment. The photo that you're referring to is of the Ripple Rhythm 4, I believe. And that, I think, is from 1940. There's actually a couple of images from the same photo shoot, I guess, from the same moment, with the band posed a little bit differently. But it's 4 guys, one of them Sonny Blunt. They're all wearing white dinner jackets and black pants, I think. It's a vocal quartet, primarily, and there's a fair amount of press notices from that time, like late 1940, early 1941, of the Ripple Rhythm 4 performing around town and being popular, but primarily as a vocal group. You know, Sonny led his own orchestra, but this was a little sort of an offshoot kind of deal. And the photo is so intriguing because the 2 guys on either ends are holding guitars. One of them's holding a resophonic guitar, like people might associate a dobro. And, you know, I wish that we could hear what the Ripple Rhythm 4 sounded like, but Birmingham had a really distinctive, unique, and influential jazz culture that is really an unsung tradition and an untold story that I've been working to kind of get out there. But it also had maybe a little bit better known vocal gospel quartet tradition as well. The Ripple Rhythm 4, I'm sure, borrowed from that tradition. In fact, the caption in that photo, it was published in local African-American newspapers here, indicates one of the band members is a guy, Clarence Driscoll, who was a gospel quartet singer. And this band, or this group, from everything I can tell, was a predominantly, if not entirely, secular music group, but must have borrowed from the rhythms and harmonies that were very prevalent. I mean, there were many, many, many vocal gospel quartets in town. And once Sonny got to Chicago, one of the many musical influences that he had there was working with vocal groups, doo-wop, kind of early doo-wop groups and things like that. And I'm sure that his training in Birmingham equipped him in some way, or informed in some way, even the work that he did there. Anyway, I said I would tell you about when I first saw that photo. I was at the archive here in Birmingham, just scrolling through one of the local African-American newspapers of the day, and was not specifically looking for Sonny Blunt material, but was just seeing whatever I could find on the local jazz scene. And that paper and those papers really don't have a ton of photographs of local musicians in them. So I was knocked out to discover this photo that had Sonny Blunt. And I thought, I've never seen this photo, republished anywhere, nor have I seen a photo this early of Sun Ra. So, I printed it up there on the little printer at the archive, went over to pay my 25 cents or whatever it was to the librarian, and I was shaking. I was so excited. And I said to the guy, "Do you know who this is? This is young Sun Ra." And the guy knew who Sun Ra was, and at least shared somewhat in my excitement. And I remember him saying, people in this town don't know enough. They don't celebrate Sun Ra enough in his Birmingham connections. There should be a statue or something, And I remember driving home that day and thinking, there should be some greater commemoration of Sun Ra in Birmingham. This was while I was working with Doc Adams. This was before our book came out. Actually, the original book came out in 2012 in hardback. It was recently reissued in paperback last year, or 2018. And Doc passed away in 2014. But in the meantime, the centennial of Sun Ra's arrival was coming up. And so Doc and I together organized a series of Sun Ra celebrations at the Alabama Jazz Hall of Fame. And I say all of that just to say, driving home, so excited about that photo is kind of what inspired us to do this series of Sun Ra celebrations at the Jazz Hall of Fame. But yes, it's a great photo, and it's like doing a lot of Sun Ra research, or a lot of any kind of research. Really, it's so tantalizing, because what did this group sound like? What was their repertoire? There's so many questions that it raises that it doesn't answer, but it's thrilling to see.
It's a major discovery. And what is fun about it is that it is so rare. And the fact that what at the time would have been probably a trivial news piece and something that exists in newsprint and paper could hold so much power and meaning. And to hear you express that sense of joy, I can absolutely share in that and put myself in your place. I probably wouldn't have slept for at least 24 hours after that.
Yeah.
And the other tantalizing thing about that photo is that vocal group context with the guitars is very uncommon in his recorded history.
Mm-hmm.
But I also wonder what his role with that group was. Was like Sun Ra's later vocal group work, was he a writer and director, orchestrator and coach, or was he also a performer in that group vocally? Because he's not holding an instrument. He is center to that formation of young men. So was he also vocalizing with this group as well?
From what I can tell, the answer to that would be yes. I mean, I think it was truly a vocal quartet. Unlike the gospel quartets in town, they were a cappella quartets, and maybe the guitars are just props. We don't really know. But if we can believe that they played with the guitars, that is so intriguing. But I would feel certain that Sonny was singing with the group. But I feel like I've seen a reference again in local newspapers to one of the captions of, like I said, there are two photos of the Rhythm 4, and in one is really accompanied by a short article which identifies Sonny as a composer of note. He was already, certainly that was 1940. He was known by 1935 in Birmingham to be writing arrangements and compositions for his band, and so I think that carried over to this group as well. There's only passing references that I have found in the press of the day to that particular quartet, but another one does mention their performance of jazz and novelty tunes, some phrase like that. So yeah, a secular, vocal quartet, perhaps with these guitars. And whether they played, whether this was an offshoot of the Sonny Blunt Orchestra, like there is an ad from maybe 1940, 41 or so of the Rhythm 4 performing at a Christmas party in Birmingham. And that ad also mentions the Rhythm 4, but it also says something about Sonny Blunt's electronic solo vox. But that suggests that the Rhythm 4 was playing in a larger context, maybe with a full band perhaps, or at least with Sonny on his solo vox. So again, a lot of questions raised, but I would say certainly that he was a performer in that group.
While we're talking about that photograph, the other tantalizing thing about it is that the group is posed around a microphone for a local radio station, and there is mention that this group was broadcast on the local radio. So the other question that it raises for me in relation to this particular vocal combo, but also newspaper-related materials that you've found, is that there are several mentions to Sonny Blunt being broadcast on local radio. Is there any possibility that there are air checks of any of these radio appearances that Sun Ra or Sonny Blunt did on Birmingham radio?
It would be a thrill. It would be yeah, it would be a thrill. I would love to hear those, not only to hear those recordings, but to imagine them in their context, because there's also, country hillbilly bands are playing, on the same daily program as this quartet, and the variety of acts that had 15-minute radio shows in town, like in towns all over the country, is just mind-boggling, and it would be a thrill, beyond a thrill, to discover those actual sounds.
So you mentioned, the other regional genres of music in the Birmingham area, like hillbilly, on the Lost Child radio program that you do. It seems as though, in addition to the jazz of the Birmingham area, that largely your musical tastes are centered around American roots and folk music, as well as outsider and underground music. How did you make the connection with Frank Adams and discover Sun Ra's music?
So how did I make that connection? Again, like I said earlier, luck in part, or entirely. I one day walked into the Alabama Jazz Hall of Fame here in Birmingham, and that is a local museum, nonprofit. It's housed in the Carver Theater, which is a historic African-American theater downtown Birmingham. And historically, it is on 4th Avenue, which for many years was the heart of African-American social life in Birmingham, certainly commercial life, theaters, restaurants, hotels, pool rooms, offices of doctors, lawyers, architects. This was under segregation, so there was a limited stretch of commercial space where Black life thrived in town, and that was 4th Avenue. And the Carver Theater was one of many theaters once upon a time up and down that stretch of Birmingham. In years later, in the 1990s, the Carver became the home of the Alabama Jazz Hall of Fame. So it's a performing arts center. It's a museum. I would certainly emphatically encourage anyone who hears this and finds themselves in Birmingham sometime to certainly go visit the museum, which is currently under renovations. So hopefully it'll not be too much longer before we can get back in there. The Jazz Hall of Fame also is a Hall of Fame. It was started in 1978, I believe, 78 or 79, to honor this local heritage. And it began before there was a space for it as an annual induction ceremony to honor those who had contributed to the local tradition. And it did come to be a physical space with the museum, a classroom offering free jazz classes to young people. And by the time I came to the Jazz Hall of Fame, which was probably 2007 or so, that one summer day I walked in there just to see what it was about, not knowing at the time that Birmingham had specific, unique jazz heritage of its own to speak of, and not knowing anything about Frank Adams at the time. I walked in to the Jazz Hall just to check it out. You referenced my radio show and my sort of broader musical interests. Neither jazz nor Sun Ra were my, first loves musically, but I am always passionate about and drawn to music that does have a sense of place and a sense of history. And so music that has a story to it, and many different kinds of music would fit that description. But I was curious to know what there was to know about Alabama jazz beyond the little bit that I did. I walked into the museum, and the Jazz Hall is a great resource. Its mission is really in part to make this music and this history accessible to everyone who might want to access it. And so when I first walked into the Jazz Hall, I think it was $2 to tour the museum. It was $3 if you want a guided tour of the museum, which is a great price, right? And I actually declined the guided tour because I was just by myself. I was just going to look around. That I didn't think that I needed one-on-one attention, but the receptionist said, "Are you sure you you don't want, the guided tour. And I said, yeah, I don't know how long I'm going to be here, whatever. And she said again, well, are you sure? Because the tour guide is Frank Doc Adams. He's 80 years old. He played with Duke Ellington. He played with Sun Ra. He will come out and bring his horn and play some music for you and tell you some stories. So with that pitch, I had to say yes. And so I went in, and a couple minutes later or less, Frank Adams walked out from sort of the back of the museum from where his office was, and just like he always did, he was dressed, Doc always looked like he had just stepped out of the Duke Ellington Orchestra, always dressed in a suit and tie, handkerchief square, all that, and carrying his saxophone with him. And he introduced himself, and he launched this tour. And so for about an hour, about an hour and a half, I was his only guest, but he walked me through this museum, through its exhibits, told me the stories, both the historical context of the local scene, but also personal stories from his own life and from his family's life, and including some about Sun Ra. I mean, I say Sun Ra wasn't my first love, but certainly I had an awareness of Sun Ra. So they had, one of his gowns on display and some information about him there. And Doc told some stories about playing with Sonny in the 40s. And by the time this tour was over, I had first of all just fallen in love with Frank Adams because he was a magical storyteller and musician. His tone as a musician was beautiful, and his storytelling couldn't be beat. And he had just a tremendous love for his fellow human beings. He would pour himself out into whoever was in front of him. Just like this day, I walked in off the street, and he gave me all he had for about an hour and a half. And by the time that tour was over, I didn't know that day that I would be writing a book or two about this, but I understood that, okay, well, Birmingham does have this really unique story that I don't think the world knows. I don't think jazz fans know about Birmingham's significance. I don't think most of Birmingham knows about its significance in jazz. And I had never met Frank Adams before. And so here's this really remarkable human being. And so I knew that I wanted to spend some more time with him. I knew that I would like to do some small something to help tell that story. I thought I would write an article about this or something, but it was a year later that I finally called the Hall of Fame and asked to speak to Doc. And I said, would you be willing to sit down with me for an interview? Again, thinking that perhaps this would be a magazine article, wanting to do it as an oral history. I've done work in oral history, and I'm very compelled by hearing people's stories in their own voices. So my main goal was really just to sit down with the tape recorder with Doc Adams and preserve some of that story, to be around him, learn from him, and then have this for an archive or whatever one day. But sure enough, he invited me back to the Hall of Fame for the interview, and I'll tell you this, he was an incredible talker. Doc could talk for hours, and sometimes when that's true of someone, it makes them a great bore, but in Doc's case, he was someone who I would happily sit and listen to hours of Doc uninterrupted speaking. It had been a year since I met Doc until I went back to meet him again. And in the interim, I'd done some research. I'd taken lots of notes. I had 6 pages in a notebook of questions for him because he had the Sonny Blunt connection. He'd played with Duke Ellington as well. He was there in Birmingham in its civil rights days. He came from a politically prominent African-American family in Birmingham. There was so much to talk about. So I came with 6 pages of handwritten questions, and I sat down and turned on the tape recorder. And before I could ask the first question, Doc began by saying, I was born on Groundhog's Day, February 2nd, 1928. And he just talked. Without pausing for a question, he just talked for a couple of hours and told his story in intimate detail, just great detail, working basically chronologically from his birth forward, so that by the end of 2 hours, he was about to graduate from high school, and with a recommendation letter to Howard University by Sonny Blunt, and he said, "We're going to have another session." I, of course, said yes, and the next week I came back. We had a second session. The next week I came back, and after 6 weeks, or perhaps on the 6th week, I said, I don't even know how to approach this story as an article anymore, but I do think it should be a book. And from that moment on, we continued with that in mind. And it was literally over a year and a half of weekly tape-recorded interviews, so hours and hours and hours of interviews that became the transcripts that became edited to be the book. And I don't suppose that we have said this yet, but the book is a work of oral history. There's an introduction in my voice, but the rest of it is first person as Doc, and it's edited. Things are moved around from those year and a half of interviews, but all of the words are words spoken in those conversations by Frank Adams.
One of the points that you made was that part of your inspiration for documenting this story was not only Doc's great ability to recollect and tell a story, but also that largely this story is untold. And I think that the unique thing, at least for me, about Doc is that so much of contemporary scholarship about jazz in particular is that it relies on the recorded works of these musicians to raise their profile and to keep awareness of them going throughout the decades. And interestingly, before Frank transitioned into full-time education, as a younger person, he was heavily involved in getting his chops by performing in the area's bands, but largely that music scene was about performance in local venues, and he did not actually officially record for any regional or major labels. So we don't have any released recordings of Doc's music.
That's mostly correct. In Birmingham, I've come to realize he certainly does have a reputation, but it is a regional reputation for sure, because he did make his living and his life and his music here, and because he did that as an educator, first and foremost. I mentioned him playing with Duke Ellington, and just for a little bit of context there. So Doc was in high school when he was in Sonny's band. Doc went to Howard University in Washington, D.C. In 1945, about a year before Sonny left Birmingham. While at Howard, Doc belonged to helped start a group called the Howard Swing Masters. One of his bandmates was jazz legend Benny Golson. Most of the Swing Masters ended up in the bands of Billie Holiday or Cab Calloway or whoever after college. And Doc worked picking up, gigs with whatever local musicians around DC, which was a great area for a working jazz musician in that time. And his connection with Duke Ellington was essentially as a substitute, filling in for the Ellington band. And Ellington called on him in that role off and on pretty often for during that time period. Doc graduated from Howard in 1949 and continued to play, again, in and out of the Ellington Orchestra and just around town. But in 1950, decided to come back to Birmingham. He didn't know then that he was coming back to Birmingham to stay. I think he really thought that he would go back out on the road with bands. But he came back, and he got a job at Lincoln Elementary School in Birmingham. That's where he had learned. That's where he'd gone to school. His band teacher at Lincoln was the band teacher that he replaced when he came back in 1950. His band teacher was W. Handy, the nephew of W.C. Handy, famous as the father of the blues. But this was William Wise Handy. And Doc learned from him, and then at the high school from Fess Whatley, who was the very influential local music teacher. Again, somebody who never recorded, but hugely, hugely influential. And Fess Whatley was Sonny Blunt's band leader and teacher as well in high school. Doc comes back in 1950 into the Lincoln band room, doesn't plan to stay there forever, but falls in love with the kids and falls in love with his mission of educating them. Everybody that I have talked to who's younger than Doc, but maybe who was his student, everybody is in agreement that not only was he an outstanding music teacher, but he was an outstanding musician who sounded, like I say, he looked like he had just come out of the Ellington Orchestra, and he sounded like it too. He was really praised locally as a musician and by his students who knew that, he would teach all day and then he would go out and play at night and on weekends, but locally. So to come back where we started, this is a long answer to your question, but right. So he did not record during that time. He did not make any commercial recordings, I should say. And his influence was like the influence of Fess Whatley. It was in the training of many, many musicians. And so when he was in the first round of inductees to the Alabama Jazz Hall of Fame, which is interesting because there were all these musicians from Birmingham, and that's quite an honor, to be in the first round of inductees, 6 inductees. 3 of the musicians that year belonged to the Erskine Hawkins Orchestra. One of them was Erskine Hawkins himself. The whole band had come out of Birmingham. So 3 of those first inductees were Erskine Hawkins musicians, and the other 3 were teachers. Fess Whatley, who was inducted posthumously, and Amos Gordon, who has a similar story to Frank Adams. He left Birmingham to play with Louis Armstrong. He was Louis Armstrong's arranger as he kind of developed a big band in the 40s. But then Gordon did what Doc did. He came back to Alabama and taught for the rest of his life. And so the 3rd teacher in that group was the youngest inductee of the first batch, and that was Frank Adams. And I just think that speaks to not his fame, because he wasn't famous, but it speaks to his influence as an educator, and it speaks to how highly he was regarded as an active, acting, working musician in town. Around the same time that the Jazz Hall of Fame was founded, a group called the Birmingham Heritage Band was founded. This is, again, 1978, 1979. And the idea of that group was to bring together some of these musicians who had gone out and played for Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Cab Calloway, Louis Armstrong, etc., and then had done what Doc did, what Amos Gordon did. They came back home. And so the Birmingham Heritage Band was sort of a local supergroup of those musicians. And there are some, local recordings of the Heritage Band. That's why I said you were mostly correct in saying that there are no recordings of Doc. There are some recordings locally of the Heritage Band, but that is it.
And it seems as though the Birmingham music scene and jazz scene specifically was really not only fulfilled a community role for music and congregation, but it was really a incubator for these young jazz musicians to find their path. And some of them became educators, and some of them, to attain those recording dates, ended up having to leave Birmingham and go to other areas to find full-time national touring work or recording dates, and that was not the path that Doc Adams took. What is interesting in hearing you talk about this is that folk music American roots music, traditional music, and jazz are largely dependent on teaching and education and the transference of that knowledge and that heritage, either in one-on-one conversation and instruction or in educational institutions. And we have Doc Adams, you mentioned Fess Whatley, and we know that Sonny Blunt in early years was part of Fess Whatley's band, Fess being a very well-known educator and supporter of young musicians. And Sonny Blunt later ended up deciding that he didn't want the spotlight and to be a professional musician and went to teachers college.
Right.
So I'm wondering, how large of a role does education play in that Birmingham music scene of the era, in addition to just the cultural entertainment aspect of it? Was that specifically part of the jazz scene, or is that a characteristic that is also a part of Birmingham as an area, but Birmingham music specifically?
Okay, you have asked the million-dollar question, and it's fascinating, and that's the question right there. I will say, first of all, as you referenced, I think the role of educators, formal educators in school, out of school too, but actual, literal professional educators in the development of jazz nationally is something that, scholars have written about, but it's something that is underestimated and underplayed a great deal in general, not just in Birmingham. But in Birmingham specifically, the link between education and the jazz culture and community is essential. And it's such a strong link between the education and jazz in Birmingham that I think that is really what makes Birmingham unique. Even though, like I say, there are other jazz educators around the country historically who played a similar role to Fess Whatley, but Fess Whatley was such an extreme version of this. So what happened in Birmingham, and this is really why there's this tradition, Fess Whatley taught at Industrial High School, which became Parker High School in the 1940s. He taught there from 1917 to 1964. Industrial High School was founded in 1901, I think, 1900 or 1901. And as its original name suggests, it was an industrial high school. This was Alabama at the turn of the 20th century, and this was the Booker T. Washington philosophy of education. The idea was, under segregation, the idea was that schools should train African American boys and girls to work with their hands, to learn some practical, technical skill that they could then earn a living with. It was not designed to. That was the goal. And so you have a school like Industrial High School that follows this Booker T. Washington philosophy of industrial education, and the students spend about half of their day engaged in their particular industrial training. So, of course, they do have their academic subjects, and Industrial/Parker High School alums took great pride in the academic training at that school as well. But half of the day then was spent on the industrial side. And so it was like you had your major, you learned a particular trade. It was printing or shoe repair or automotive repair or sewing, domestic work. There were gendered activities, but that was the structure of the education. And what made Birmingham distinctive is that when Fess Whatley arrived in the school in 1917, he was hired as a printing instructor, but he also was a talented musician. And so Fess Whatley, some of the older musicians would joke that he bootlegged band instruction into the school, because technically he's there for printing, but his idea was that band is an industrial discipline. It's something that you can do with your hands to make a living. And so he taught officially printing, but also band. And that band program grew so quickly that they hired an additional teacher for that role, but it was really seen as Fess Whatley's band. So what that means is that when a student graduated from industrial high school in his teens, and it would be his teens, again, this was also a gendered thing. There were no girls in Fess Whatley's band, but when a student graduated, he got a job working, playing music. And so whereas other graduates were going, into one of these other industrial trades, you might be joining the Count Basie or Cab Calloway band if you were one of Fess Whatley's students. And his reputation was so great that those band leaders I just named and all the other major African-American and not so major band leaders of the day knew the reputation of Fess Whatley, and they knew the reputation of Birmingham. And it all coincided with the rise of the big bands. And so Fess Whatley's training was incredibly rigid. Reading music was essential. We think of jazz, we think of improvisation and experimentation and all that, but not Fess Whatley. I mean, we're talking very rigid, sticking to the score. But what that meant was, with big band music on the rise and swing music on the rise, Duke Ellington or whoever knew that if it was a Birmingham musician, that person would be able to read, that person would not need to audition, that person would not need to rehearse. They can pick up the part right away. That person probably can play at least a couple of instruments. A lot of Birmingham musicians, like Sonny Blunt, although he's special, but a lot of Birmingham musicians were writers and arrangers. So that's why Amos Gordon, that I mentioned, was arranging for Louis Armstrong, so on and so on. So anyway, I'm getting all excited because it's the heart of the story is the education community, and so yeah, those two things would be inseparable.
So many years ago.
People I respect, like Fess Whatley in Birmingham, Alabama.
Could you tell us about Fess Whatley? There are these educators, many of your musicians, and in a way, this is a linkage because your musicians were trained largely by Walter Dyett at DeSable High School, and you met one of the great Black educators who organized a school system with music in Birmingham.
He had a
Fess
band.
Whatley, and a band. And Wilson Driver still survives from that.
And I played with him, and he had this huge repertoire. Everything that was new came out, he had it. That's when I know a lot of show tunes and a lot of things other musicians don't know.
Did you do the summer tours with Fess Whatley when he would leave Birmingham and when school was out and you would come north and play somewhere across the summer months? Did you ever do that?
No, he had Curly Parrish playing with him. See, that was a school teacher's band. I was still a student. So therefore, I didn't belong in that band. But it happened that disagreement came against Curly in some way in Fess Whatley, and he left. And he had this huge repertoire. He had to have somebody who could sight read.
So can you tell me about the Birmingham culture, and specifically the music culture, that people like Doc Adams, Sonny Blunt, Fess Whatley were involved in at the time?
I was just mentioning how the educational component is central to the Birmingham story, but also needs to be, but is also underestimated in jazz history in general, the role of educators. Likewise, the role of the middle class and middle class organizations like, the fraternal organizations, the Masons and Oddfellows and Elks and those institutions really supported the jazz scene here in Birmingham and elsewhere. You can hear interviews with Sun Ra where he mentions the society element of Birmingham, that these were in large part so-called society dance bands that dominated the scene, whereas both Sonny Blunt and Frank Adams and all these other musicians really learned to play, got their first working jobs was at the quote-unquote colored Masonic Temple on 4th Avenue, right across the street from the Carver Theater theater. That venue hosted all kinds of meetings and gatherings and parties and balls. That venue hosted out-of-town acts like the Duke Ellington Orchestra or any of the big bands that came through town. But on a constant basis, that venue and others like it, the Elks Rest, supported these so-called society bands. You know, they all wore tuxedos. They play a lot of sweet music, a lot of, you know, not necessarily what we would today think of as jazz so much as just kind of a softer dance music. But their repertoires were wide-ranging so that, you know, Fess Whatley could play, as they would say, sweet and hot. He could play it both ways. It's an interesting kind of tension in the community between, this is a place that generated so many jazz musicians, but as you can also hear Sonny Blunt Sun Ra talk about in a handful of his old interviews at the school, you know, Fess Whatley, like I said before, doesn't want you to deviate from the score. If you try to pick out your own solo, you know, he's going to shut that down. So there was this kind of disconnect at the school and at some of these society functions. But at the same time, those functions in that school are really producing these great musicians. And that was the goal of Fess Whatley, was to train these players to be ready for anything once they got out of high school. Then they could play. You know, they could play as hot as they wanted to, whatever, but first they had to know the discipline. But this is very much a world of tuxedos and gowns and lavish parties, you know, kind of imagine a debutante ball kind of situation. This is an African-American community, middle-class community. These were the kinds of social functions that these bands were supporting. But that said, it should be pointed out that, number one, Sun Ra, who is maybe the last person you would think came from that world, that, you know, he grew up very much immersed in this society tradition. But also, maybe a little bit more predictably, by the time he left Birmingham, anecdotally, we know from Frank Adams and others that he was branching out. He wasn't playing anymore the quote-unquote bow tie jobs of the Masonic Temple and Elks Rest. Increasingly, he was playing in a little bit looser of a kind of venue sometime style. So he was beginning to push the boundaries a bit by the time he left Birmingham, but was very much shaped by a very conventional middle-class society dance party scene.
But an important distinction that Doc conveyed in your book is that the Sonny Blunt Orchestra, as well as playing those society engagements, had two differentiators. One, that while they played those society functions, Sonny also played very much in the tenements, on the street, etc., and was playing to an additional different audience. And in being able to do so, whereas Fess's band was highly scored and also playing, you know, those 3-minute, 78-sided timed compositions, the Sonny Blunt Orchestra in that tenement scene was stretching out his compositions, and if the dancers were dancing, he would stretch out those tunes to 15 to 30 minutes, which you had mentioned that by the end of his time in Birmingham, he was already additionally exploring other types of musics and sensibilities. But it sounds like concurrently with those society dates that he was already doing that by stretching out his compositions or his performances far past what was normal for the other bands.
Right. That seems to be correct. And a more of a willingness to engage with the blues, too. Fess Whatley's blues are the W.C. Handy orchestrated blues, right? The strict composition form of that. But Sonny was a little bit grittier, at least by the 40s, according to all accounts that I've seen. Like you say, still very much of both worlds, still of that society world, but able to stretch out and maybe do something. Not wear tuxedos, you know, wear a T-shirt or whatever you've got is something that Doc would say it would be a difference. And, you know, the band was they weren't all dressed in matching tuxedos. They were just what Fess Whatley would call back in the alley kind of music.
Years back when we played a dance in Talladega College, he had an old raggedy car he had rented from somebody. And he had one of these things that had a trailer to it, an old wooden broken trailer with a top, that all the instruments were put in that trailer. And he drove all the way to Talladega College. We went out and played. And instead of waiting around a while, he had one car, so it was cramped in that car. Everybody ran and jumped in there and squeezed in there. And by the time he got the money and all, there was no room for the leader. So he crawled back in the back of that little wagon back there with all the cymbals and drums and stuff falling on top of him. And I guess I wasn't the only one, but I felt bad about that because my folks had taught me to respect leadership regardless of race or whatever. That was the leader, man. And here you got him back there like somebody going through Jerusalem, in the back of a donkey or something, And so I said, no. I said, now, this is going to get everybody terminated. Everybody in this band will be fired tomorrow. We went to get the money. Listen, he said not a mumbling word about it, man. He didn't say one word. And like I said, I always put things together in perspective. Now, I've been around Lucky Miller, Andy Cook, Duke Ellington, Fess Wadley, anybody you can name. But I've never seen a person like that. Duke Ellington was a tremendous guy. And he did some humanitarian things too, a lot he didn't talk about. Fess Wadley was too. But there never, Count Basie was. But there never was a Sun Ra. And in your lifetime, if you ever meet a person like that would ride back in one of those things like that and do everything in his life to succeed with what he thinks, he can't be stopped. You understand? You can't stop him. He's not interested in any clothes, any wives. He's not interested in anything but his music. That's why he could conceive himself as coming from another planet. Are you following me? Because nobody was like him. He really believed that. So it didn't matter. Like I would say, Joe Guy, the trumpet player who was married to Billie Holiday, I could say, Sonny, I'm impressed with him. He can really play, man. I like to do some things. And he would say, yes, he's fine. But he only plays for himself. He only plays, he doesn't care whether you like. He sits there and gets paid for playing for himself. In other words, what's in you, he felt would come out. Although you're stumbling and messing up, he could hear something in you,
So that was a compliment to Joe Guy that he only played for himself.
No, that was an insult that Joe was selfish. He was just, if you trace his life with Billie Holiday, he was just as selfish, and he took dope because he wanted to get high. He wasn't caring about you. He did this. This is selfishness. To even die before your time is selfish. That's what Sun Ra would say. Say, no, that's the biggest thing. People need you, you see. And see, he needed me perhaps, and I betrayed him. See, I left. Are you following me? What I'm saying? So if you look at it in that perspective, you can see where he is coming from. Yeah, Joe's fine. He's fine, but he's just sitting there playing. He doesn't care whether his music is good or valid for you. It's him.
A venue that you have mentioned repeatedly and is also spoken to in the book is the Masonic Temple. And I'm curious, do you have any insight into knowing Sun Ra's evolving interests and in the esoteric and wordplay and hidden knowledge? Are you aware of any involvement with the Masonic organization itself as a potential early engagement with that type of knowledge?
That is a question that I am actively interested in finding a good answer to. So perhaps some of your listeners will have some extra insight, but all I can say for right now is I think there had to have been an influence. I mean, these fraternal organizations were so central to the world of this music in Birmingham. So this whole the secret societies and the initiation rituals and, all that goes with that very much informed the youth of Sun Ra. Getting more specifically into what did he borrow from the Masons, if anything, explicitly, or, those are questions that I want to spend some more time with. I think there has to be some degree of influence there.
And it had to start somewhere. And we have to keep in mind that not only did Sun Ra, Sonny Blunt, he was born into Birmingham. He spent his childhood there in his early years, but he was there throughout his mid to late 20s. So not only his musical foundation and concerns, but also his larger, what Sun Ra would refer to as his cosmos view. We have to assume that that also would be taking form and being informed during his time in Birmingham.
And incidentally, the John Swed book does mention that as a boy that Sonny was involved with the American Woodmen, which is a fraternal organization in their junior division. So he talks a little bit about that in that book. But yeah, I feel that there's probably a lot more to be said.
So that Masonic organization in Birmingham, another thing that is covered, I believe, in the John Swed book is that Sun Ra also spent a lot of time as a young person in their library doing research along those lines as well. So what I'd like to do is talk about the influence Birmingham, Alabama on Sun Ra's later years. Notoriously, once Sun Ra left Birmingham, for all intents and purposes, he stopped talking about Birmingham. And he would later say that he was not born there. He was not born on this planet. As far as we know, Sun Ra, once he left Birmingham, until his later years and was inducted into the Hall of Fame, he never came back to perform. Despite the fact that, for all intents and purposes, he outwardly, in his communication, disowned Birmingham and put that behind him, pivotal work that the Sun Ra Orchestra released in 1965 was titled The Magic City, which is the nickname for Birmingham. As far as I know, the reason that Birmingham received this nickname was because of the growth and development of the city in the early part of the 20th century, and that it magically grew overnight. And the Magic City in 1965, we can assume based on its title that it, in some way, it must refer back to Birmingham, Alabama.
Yeah, that is another great question. Of course, that album is The Magic City because of Birmingham. I have thought, what are the sonic connections that you could make? What even in the album cover can speak some kind of a connection? But I hesitate to try to get into Sun Ra's head or put my own interpretation onto that piece of music as in some way reflective or response to Birmingham. I know a lot of Sun Ra fans will know that he grew up right across the street from the great sign in Birmingham that said, welcome to the Magic City, because he grew up right across from the terminal station, the gigantic, beautiful train station, which tragically was finally torn down many years later, and the sign with it. We have a sort of replica of that sign now. But so he grew up looking at that sign, the Magic City, and certainly was informed by that. I mean, if all of Sun Ra's music offers an alternative to our earthly experience, I think the Magic City in some way must offer an alternative, universe, an alternative city that is not the city that he grew up in. That's a city and that's a nickname. It makes sense that Sonny would be from a place called the Magic City. It makes sense if this is a person whose name, who Herman Blunt, if Sonny's name came from the magician Black Herman. I mean, there's magic all around Sonny from the very beginning. Just makes sense. I think you really hit the nail on the head with another sort of line of questioning here and line of thought, which is if Sun Ra famously did sort of never look back, right, and invent another past for himself, if he did reject the very notion of a birthplace and like an earthly hometown, then what is his relationship to Birmingham after he leaves? And to me, that's a very compelling part of all of this, because I think we overestimate the break with Birmingham. I think that Birmingham sort of rears its head in Sonny's music and in his persona in surprising ways for the rest of his life. And certainly, even if it's just the title of the Magic City and the poem, The Magic City, that goes with that, even if it's just that, I mean, there's a connection. But he maintained a lifelong relationship with Walter Miller, a musician from Birmingham who was in the same band with Frank Adams back in the 40s. He maintained at least a friendly relationship, at least for a while, with the Bascom brothers, Paul and Dud Bascom, who were members of the Erskine Hawkins Orchestra, and in the 50s they worked a little bit with Sonny in Chicago. He later in life, this is not somebody they would have grown up with, but the musician Jothan Collins, who was a member of the orchestra and who really kind of brought Sonny back home in his last days on this planet. It's no coincidence that Jothan Collins is from Birmingham. So he had these personal connections that he maintained from this to the city. As somebody that is so driven by this question of Birmingham and jazz and Birmingham and Sun Ra, I'm always just thrilled when I passing reference in one of his interviews to the city of Birmingham, because he does, from time to time he would mention, some of the people from back home that he spoke of fondly. From time to time he would mention that society scene, even though it would seem to go against the image of Sun Ra. He mentions in an interview, I've seen Sun Ra talk about a couple of influences of Fess Whatley on him being, for one thing, the size of the band itself. It's interesting that as all of Sonny's classmates, like in the Erskine Hawkins Orchestra, are kind of shutting their big band down because the big band days are gone, the big band tradition continues in a totally new way through Sonny, who maintains this huge orchestra. And in at least one interview, I've seen him, connect that to Fess Whatley, the size of the band and the breadth of the repertoire, because Fess Whatley could play whatever the event demanded because he was a professional musician. So he could play hot music, he could play sweet music, he could play everything in between. Sonny has talked about in interviews the experience, and Doc Adams talked about this a lot, staying up all night with his friends, making music in these marathon rehearsals, which would become the rest of Sonny's life as a musician, is those marathon, the never-ending music making sort of in his home. That's something that has its beginnings in these late night band practices in Birmingham that he developed into an art form. Even the sort of pageantry of Sun Ra being so of its own. I mean, there's nothing else like Sun Ra's pageantry. But, he would speak in interviews about how the musicians back in those days when he was growing up knew how to dress, right? And they knew how to present themselves as an alternative to the reality that a young black man like Sonny faced growing up. These men on stage with their tuxes and all that were something else. And I think he just exaggerated that idea to a huge degree. But I think that has some roots in the very kind of conventional, we would think, conventional music of his upbringing. So I don't know. Those are a few things that come to mind. But I think that there are a lot of ways in which, as much as Sun Ra seems to have come out of nowhere or come from another dimension, from another planet, whatever, there's a lot of ways in which, even at his furthest extremes from what seems conventional or traditional, it's all there. I mean, we all the Sun Ra fans will know his ability to weave the history of jazz music into a single performance. So that traces back to some of the music that he would have encountered in Birmingham. And if I can say one other thing that is fascinating to me, when you mention Sun Ra leaves Birmingham and he doesn't come back until the end of his life, this planet. He comes back in, I think, 1988 to be inducted to the Jazz Hall of Fame. He comes back for his induction to the Jazz Hall of Fame. He comes back in 88 for a show at the Nick, which is like a rock venue. And that's a sort of legendary concert for a lot of people here in Birmingham. Unfortunately, I was not at that, but I talked to a lot of people who were there and for whom that's a memorable, legendary kind of night. In 1989, the city launched a music festival that stuck around for, 20 years or something. There was a music festival called City Stages, and Sun Ra played both the first in 89 and the second one in 1990, and played like an after-hours show at a local jazz club in 1990 after his City Stages show. And the Southern Dance Works show, that's while he was in town for City Stages the first year, I think. So he started to, reclaim, I don't know what the right word is, but there was a revival of Birmingham and the life of Sun Ra in his later years before, of course, he came here to depart ultimately. But the thing a moment ago I started to raise that in the Alton Abraham collection at the University of Chicago, you mentioned all the papers and files and everything. There is a letter from the 1960s from Alton Abraham to Fletcher Myatt in Birmingham, Alabama. That is Fletcher Hootie Myatt, who Frank Adams used to talk a lot about. He was the singer in Sonny's band, and Fletcher Myatt took over the band, as I understand it, when Sonny left Birmingham. He took over from Sonny. And I think he was involved in just like local promotion of events in town, music events. But there's a letter from the 1960s in which Alton Abraham says, can you set us up a show in Birmingham? And that is one of those hugely tantalizing things to me. There's not an answer in the files there from Fletcher Myatt to let us know what happened. But even if there was no show that happened, and it was indeed not until the late 80s that Sun Ra returned to Birmingham, the fact that he was looking for a show in Birmingham in the 60s is remarkable if you take for granted this idea that he never looked back, right? So that's another one of those mysteries that I would love to have some more answers to.
There's two other Alabama and Birmingham specific compositions that I've thought of as well that he performed. One was a original composition called The Place of 5 Points.
Mm-hmm. It's an intersection. It's like a 5 Points intersection in downtown Birmingham, but it's a neighborhood basically.
And then additionally, in the 80s, the orchestra performed the Jothan Collins composition titled Alabama.
Oh, I didn't know that. I think absolutely. There's more of a fondness and there's more of a direct line, a thread, right, than we assume. For somebody who cares a lot about Sun Ra and his music and his mythology and everything, I think that's important. Incidentally, one other, you turn out, these songs with the connections to Birmingham. Hours After, I believe, there's a title he liked a lot. I think he used it for a couple of compositions, but Hours After has to be an inversion of After Hours, which is the tune by his old Birmingham friend Avery Parrish, which was a huge hit for the Erskine Hawkins Orchestra, and any piano player knew that song well, and I've always assumed that's got to be in some way an homage to After Hours.
Avery Parrish being a childhood friend of Sonny Blunt's, who was also a fellow piano player, and the story is that they would play two-person piano four-handed duets. And supposedly, Avery Parrish is the person that challenged Sonny Blunt to write his first compositions, most famously being the song Chocolate Avenue, which was then sent to Clarence Williams and recorded, I believe, in 1933, uncredited to Sonny Blunt, but inspired by that challenge of Avery Parrish for Sun Ra to start writing.
Did I tell you about when he came here to get his award? No. Well, he came here to be put in the Hall of Fame. In fact, I was the one that since I was working here, I recommended him. In Birmingham, they knew about him, but he was just a weird entity to them. And he came here, he brought one drum, a little snare drum, and a fella with him that if you saw them both, you would determine that they were crazy right off. But there he was at this Hall of Fame thing. And it was a beautiful affair. We had Joe Jones, the great drummer, and that's the night that Joe Jones was inducted, and they had a lot of the big ones in that are in the Hall of Fame now. And after the event was over, I hadn't spoken to him for years. In fact, I doubt whether he knew that I nominated him. But on the way out, I saw him at the piano. His back was turned to me, and I said, "Sun Ra, Sonny," I called him, "Sun Ra, do you know who this is?" He didn't say anything. I said, "Do you know who this is?" He said, "Of course. You're my saxophone player. You're Frank Adams." Then he turned around on his seat, and this is where I had to unload a lot of things on him. Ego, you know. I said, "Listen, man, I have played with Duke Ellington's orchestra. I'm supervisor of music for Birmingham schools, and I made these records. I'm making recordings and all. And my wife is a teacher. She's out in the county teaching 5th grade." And I said, then I've got a son since I saw you. My son, he's at Boston University playing in the symphony, and blah, 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 blah. And he looked at me, and you know, you want somebody to say, "Oh, that's wonderful," but you know what he said? "That's a disgrace." I said, "What do you mean?" He stood there. He thought I felt like a corkscrew going down in the ground. You know, my ego had been shattered, man. I mean, he said, that's very bad. That's a disgrace." I said, "Now he's gonna tell me this, and this weird creature." I said, "If you're telling me something about my life is a failure, you know." And he stared at each other. And I started thinking, he thought that I should never have been away from his band. That was all that mattered with him. I should still be playing in his intergalactica orchestra. You know, that was what I was here for. Not to have a family, not to do anything. That was his world, you see.
As a resident of Birmingham and a broadcaster and an educator and an author and someone who's involved in that local community, I'm curious, are there any kind of local traits of people from Birmingham that, even though Sun Ra left Birmingham and went on to other great things in Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia, are there any kind of characteristics of his personality and his work that you would associate as being from Birmingham, Alabama?
The John Swed bio says this, and Frank Adams used to say this too, but I don't know that this is meaningful. But, you know, the idea that Birmingham, for all of its profound historical civil rights abuses, that Birmingham has always been tolerant of outsiders or, eccentrics. Doc used to say that too in the context of Sonny Blunt, that, he was weird, but, we had weird people and they were part of the family, but, people, when they talk about Southern literature, they talk about not just Birmingham, but the outsiders or the eccentrics that you just kind of take for granted and that you love because they're your, neighbor or whatever. Now, that said, is that really different than the rest of the world? Or, I don't know. So I'm not going to go on the record saying that that's a Birmingham thing.
As a native of New England, no, we don't all do that. And that's exactly the kind of local cultural insight I was hoping that you would refer to, because no, we don't all do that. And I think that speaks to perhaps something about Birmingham, Alabama, that allowed Sonny Blunt and Sun Ra to be the being that he was and grow into the being that he wanted to be. So people can reach you to learn more about all of the things that you do at burginmathews.com. And they can also tune into you on your radio show, The Lost Child, on 107.3 FM, Birmingham Mountain Radio, which is also available streaming online. And Burgin, thank you so much for your time and all of the work and all of the research that you're doing. I'm deeply, deeply grateful of it. And I encourage everybody to immediately go out and to buy your book and check out your website and blog. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Christopher. I've enjoyed this a lot. Bye.
Bye-bye. Excerpts of the music of Sun Ra are used with permission of Sun Ra LLC. Sun Ra Arkive, Episode 2, copyright 2020, Sun Ra Arkive with a K.